Good afternoon, everybody. This is our second live podcast of the day. And if you're joining us live, it is November 8th, 2024. It is approximately 1 p.m. on the East Coast. And some of you are just joining us now. So if you heard that part, you're probably watching it in a postcast. So today I'm very excited to bring two people to the podcast, Tales from the Heart, a podcast from the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association. And we're going to just bring Dr. Lever off screen for a moment. And we are here today with Dr. Harry Lever and David Light, and we are going to be talking about generic drug quality and generic drug availability and testing. So, for those who've been following the podcast for a while, they have heard Dr. Harry Lever and I talk for many, many days about the problems about drug quality. And we've mentioned we've mentioned David Light, and we've mentioned the Valisher. So, we brought him here to talk to you about his research and his project and to get a better understanding of where we are today and what we need to do to solve the problem. So I'm going to be a little bit more formal than normal with Dr. Lever today and asking him to introduce himself because I'm really hoping that all of you share this particular podcast far and wide in your networks. This is not just about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We're talking about something much larger than that, and that is the quality of our generic drug supply in the United States. So, Dr. Lever, would you please introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your clinical background and your interest in this topic?
Well, I got interested in this problem of the drugs purely by accident. I was driving to work on May the 25th of 2007, listening to NPR, and a program came up about food and drugs from China, and I didn't know anything about it. And unfortunately, my beeper went off, and I went into work, and I started doing Google searches and found out that there were drugs were coming in from other places that I didn't know about. And at about that time, there was a problem with the drug heparin, and it was written up in the New York Times, and there were bad things that happened. Stuff was contaminated coming out of China, and almost 200 people died. And so it caused me that all these things caused me to start looking at other drugs, and I started finding problems. I had no availability of testing. All I had was the patient in front of me, and I'd see people that would come in. I was treating a lot of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and they were on metoprolol succinate, and all of a sudden, people weren't doing well on the drug when they had been doing well on it, and I began to wonder what was going on, and we found out that there was an Indian company that had captured 26% of the market. And when I realized what was going on, I'd start talking to the patients about the drugs they were taking, and once I switched them back to what they had been on, what I thought was a good brand, they got better. So that got me starting to think about it, and I at the same time there's a very intelligent woman who wrote a book called Bottle of Lies, and we became friends, and next thing I knew, I was in her book, and that was Catherine Eban. It was a New York Times bestseller, and I recommend everybody to look at that book, but turned out there were lots of bad problems, and that's how we got interested. And then thanks to a very good reporter at Bloomberg News, I met my friend David Light. We ended up in the same article about drugs, and when I saw what he did, I said, I've got to find him and got his phone number, and we've been good friends ever since. And it turns out he has this wonderful testing laboratory, and now things have jumped. I'm going to let him tell about that. Some jumped even further, and now there are big studies going on, and hopefully we're going to get some answers.
That's fantastic. And Harry and I, we've been working together for probably 29 years.
1996.
1996.
About November the 8th, 7th or 8th. It's actually...
It's our anniversary.
Yeah, that's right.
Happy anniversary.
All right.
It's been a long time. So, David, welcome to Tales from the Heart, and thank you for taking your time to join us. Can you give our listeners a little understanding about who you are and how you come to this problem?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks again. It's really an honor to be here with you and my good friend Harry. I mean, it's amazing the field that he's pioneered in terms of drug quality that I've came to much later. Is I'm first of all I'm a scientist by background. I'm a molecular biologist. I spent a number of years in the biotech tools world and developing DNA sequencing platforms. And so not pharma. I didn't really know much about it at all until a good friend of mine from college, his name's Adam, was telling me about all these problems he was having with his anticonvulsant medications, another area that obviously will really affect your health if there's chemistry that's off. And he was telling me a lot of what Harry described, that every once in a while he'd refill his meds and he'd feel terrible that month and have all these side effects and relapses sometimes, and talk to his doctors, and they were telling him, hey, look, there's problems out there. Everything's coming from overseas these days, and, it kind of is what it is. And he didn't like that answer and brought it to me, and we kind of looked at it from a science perspective and an entrepreneurial perspective. What could we do to try and actually solve this for patients, for the healthcare ecosystem? And I think the high level thing is that we were just kind of shocked to understand that FDA approved doesn't mean that they're actually testing it. It means that they've looked at the paperwork, they've looked at the materials, the facilities sometimes, and especially overseas, it's very hard to get there, where the vast majority of manufacturing is now in India and China. And the only people testing it are the manufacturers that are saying that it's good the vast majority of time, and that's the vast majority of the tests. And so we decided to create Valisure in an effort to add a layer of independent quality assurance, independent testing before before medications get to patients. And we started off with our own pharmacy for a while, and then have now really grown it into plugging into large health systems like Kaiser Permanente, like the military health system that we'll talk more about today in their big project. None of these things happen overnight, but we're very fortunate to see a lot more attention to this issue that is very real and serious, and trying to really grow the solutions to plug into the broader healthcare system and fix a marketplace that has been focused purely on price and blind to quality, to the point that sometimes, as Harry points out, people could be dying because of these issues, and we have to fix it.
So we're going to do something a little different for a podcast. So if you're listening to this on your podcast station, you may want to go click into YouTube on this one, or come to the Facebook page, or to LinkedIn, because there's going to be some slides we're going to show here, and they're really important to tell the story. But I do have to set this up with proper context for the date. It is November 8th. We are just past an election where there will be a change in administration. This is not a political issue. This is a bipartisan drug quality issue. The FDA has taken some heat in the past couple of days, and we need to be really aware of the fact that we need systems in place to provide oversight and security of something as important as the U.S. drug supply. We also need to make sure that they're empowered to do the right work, and that means regulatory language may need to change. And again, this is not politics, it's governance of our nation and our drug supply. So I'm encouraging everybody to kind of open up their ears, and it's not an us, them thing. This is a we thing. This is a complete we. If you live here, you really care about the quality of drugs that are coming in and what you're taking as families. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David, and I've shared your slides and you have control. David, tell us all about it.
Sure, and just to point out that most of these slides are what we were just presenting at the American Public Health Association, a big conference that gets really engaged in exactly these kinds of topics. And yeah, it's been pointed out, and I think this is actually one of the articles there on the left in Bloomberg Business Week by Anna Edney that brought Harry and I together. And there's been a lot of it, right? And to your point, regardless of administration or politics, this has really been top of mind and increasingly top of mind for the last number of years. And what you've actually heard quite a bit about in the last year or two has been drug shortages. It is obviously horrible that we live in the United States of America, and yet there's certain pediatric oncology medications that children can't get because of quality problems overseas. And as people have been pointing out, and there's just one of those one Wall Street Journal article kind of highlighted here, that these are stemming from overseas manufacturing problems. And that's just what I define as another symptom of the disease of not being blind to quality as part of our drug supply chain. And, you know, we have to do more about that. And so the reality is that our drug supply chain really is in crisis. I think COVID-19, you know, highlighted that more for people, but obviously, as Harry's pointed out, for almost 2 decades now, you know, we've been in a serious problem. And like I said, drug shortages are even one of those examples where the majority of drug shortages are due to quality problems. There's over 300 active drug shortages in the United States, record levels, never been that high. And there's constantly recalls. You know, you hear about some famous ones, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's many of them, very often due to quality issues. Some of them very serious quality issues. And you know, the fact that the supply chain has been globalized is true in many areas, but certainly as we talk about the military and the government in the United States, there's a lot of concern over the geopolitical risk, the national security threat of being so dependent on China specifically and India and just overseas manufacturing. There's been a number of Defense Department reports about this, and a number of drugs, they don't even know where they're coming from. So the lack of transparency kind of permeates throughout the supply chain beyond the dollars that it costs us and the damage to public health. And like I was saying before, I think one of the really important topics to internalize that was an eye-opener for me too, is that when you hear FDA approval, I think the average person thinks about the extremely rigorous regulatory process of developing a new drug. That's multi-year, thousands of people, clinical studies, usually $1 billion or so to get a new drug off the ground. And the FDA is heavily involved throughout that process. That's very different than the what's called abbreviated new drug application for a generic drug. It's just a few dozen people and looking at bioequivalence within a 45% window against a brand. But also none of this approval process is the actual quality and safety monitoring, the testing of the drugs, as we said, are almost largely overseas. And that testing is largely on an honor system. You know, the FDA tries to inspect as many facilities as it can. There's difficulties there, especially with COVID. But the concept of having independent testing, an independent level of quality assurance, like we expect from almost every other consumer product, we certainly believe is very complementary to these kinds of regulatory efforts, and hope to be able to work closer and closer with FDA and regulatory agencies and health systems in general. So that was what we were talking about before, kind of the whole concept of what Valisure was building out here in the US, and actually talk about, you know, here soon that it actually exists a lot in Europe. We're just going to independently check, and we're going to independently check from a chemistry perspective. You know, this is required in electronics. You can't buy a lamp in the United States without it being independently tested. You know, look at the back of a power cord. You see all these marks on it. These are being tested, you know, not just relied upon what the manufacturer is saying. And everything else you ingest and put in your body. Look at every, you know, label of all sorts of products. And we should be very concerned about what the products we put on our bodies, in our bodies. And medications are obviously no different. in terms of we should have that additional layer of quality assurance and not just look at the absolute minimum standards. So that was the concept. And just to point out here, this is all coming from the European Medicines Agency, and they have a system there in Europe, in the European Union, of what they call OMCLs, independent labs, that, as they say specifically, are testing medicines independent of the manufacturer, so there's not conflicts of interests, impartiality, and this is a fundamentally important part of ensuring quality, safety, and effectiveness of medicine. We couldn't agree more, and we obviously need more of that in the United States. And I'll just say that Europe is a very fragmented regulatory system. You have every country kind of has their own, system of supply chain. In the United States, although we have many different health systems, we have one regulatory system. We have one system of national drug codes that whether you're buying a drug, paying for a drug, reimbursing a drug, all these things that you hear about regarding drugs, all align on national drug codes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the Defense Department project. But it's actually an opportunity to do even better than just this spot testing that happens through over 70 independent laboratories in Europe. And honestly, it makes me very excited about real solutions to these issues because we have a unified system. And just to underscore the point that independent testing is really important, and not just in theory, but we've seen this over just a few years. I mean, Harry's seen this for decades in his own clinical practice, but in the few years of some independent testing by Valisher and even by others, we've seen some of the biggest drug quality recalls that you may have heard about in cardiology, the angiotensin receptor blockers, the sartan drugs, valsartan, losartan, contaminated with an extremely potent carcinogen called NDMA. And it was actually Novartis that originally identified that, looking at third-party suppliers of products and API, and found a very serious issue. And Valisher has been at the center of a lot of these other ones. Zantac, ranitidine products, metformin, one of the top diabetes drugs. We found a significant portion of the American market was also contaminated with these carcinogens and other carcinogens as we expanded what we were testing for, like benzene has been found in sunscreens, hand sanitizers, antiperspirants. And when you're looking at all of this from a manufacturing standpoint called GMP, good manufacturing practice, and you test within that box, which is a very important box for regulatory practice, a lot of these issues are missed. And that first column is the few dozen tests that the FDA runs every year on-market products for cause, where there's some reason that they really should look into it. They very often miss these issues in that kind of manufacturing style testing, which really shows that when you look at it from an independent lens, sometimes in that box, sometimes outside of that GMP box, you can find some really serious problems. And again, not in theory, in reality, what we've seen over the years, and the reality that we get a lot of debate sometimes over methodologies, but at the end of the day, these products get recalled or withdrawn from the market because it gets further validated by industry, by regulators, by other scientists, and that's why you get so much action around it. And so big question that obviously comes up next is why? Why are we seeing so many problems? Is it just because it went overseas? And it's not to say that an American manufacturer can't have an issue either. There's plenty of examples of that too. And the core of this problem is really well outlined by this University of Kentucky paper that's linked here. And they are one of the only other independent labs that sprung up to also test medications that are on market for their own health systems. I mean, huge kudos to those guys. And one of the things that this paper really points out as a core reason is that this whole market of generic drugs, which was a huge success, saved the country trillions of dollars, billions and billions in all sorts of areas, made healthcare and life-saving medications more accessible throughout the US and the world. But at the same time, it also created a market that was purely based on cost only, with quality just theoretically fixed based on this, one FDA approval, not FDA testing, FDA approval of an abbreviated process, and it's just blind to quality. And that's really the crux of the problem. That's a big driver for pushing manufacturing overseas, and a lot of the crumbling of the American manufacturing market in drugs is that nobody's valuing quality in the system. They're buying the cheapest possible product. And a lot of what gets discussed now, thankfully, due to drug shortages, due to COVID-19, due to all the problems that Harry's been talking about for decades, is that we have to fix the system. You can't have a supply chain that is purely based on cost for a complex, exquisite medicines. These are not easy things to make. And so we have to have incentives on quality. We have to recognize what is quality. We have to have transparency to it, and push for it. And this is being actively discussed in the Hill. This is just a quote here from one of these Senate hearings about, in this case, drug shortages. Why do we have drug shortages? Well, as senators have been saying, and this is on both sides of the aisle, this is a bipartisan topic, that the big problem here is we're not compensating for quality. We don't even know the differences in the quality. They're all AB rated, FDA approved, and that's the minimum standard. I think an important point to realize is that GMP, good manufacturing practice, the legal definition of that is the minimum standard to be on the shelf. It is just what's past the law. You could have a car that has no airbags, and that's legal. But is that what you want, or do you want airbags, or do you want side airbags? We're not just looking at the minimum, quality of a car to buy. We want other elements of quality, and so that's really what's been missing, and that's been a really broad call to action from various government agencies, from think tanks, from leading news organizations like Bloomberg and their opinion pieces. And the National Defense Authorization Act. The military has been very concerned about this. And thanks to some amazing work by folks like Colonel retired Victor Suarez that really pushed for this while he was on active duty last year, that the military should not only look at the logistic risk of their supply chain, which Congress mandated them to do, but also the quality risk of their supply chain of these generic drugs. And so that launched this 2-year project that we're still in the first year of, and just starting to look at the initial data. But it's a project of the Uniformed Services University, a sister agency to the Defense Health Agency, to actually assess this. Let's look at the medicines, and here looking at what's called LOE 6, Line of Effort 6. This is a multi-line effort at the Uniformed Services University. And the big one that we're contracted to help with and really drive is testing the 40 or so essential medicines on the Defense Department list, and drugs like metoprolol, tacrolimus, and a number of others that many people care about broadly, and test all the various suppliers, look at them from a chemistry perspective, objectively, in de-identified manner. And where there's reds, have additional secondary testing, have independent scoring. An expert panel reviews this of co-authors of a study that we'll talk about. And then, really importantly, take all of this data, boil it down into something simple, a red, yellow, green score, and attach it to national drug codes. And can't emphasize more how important that is. That whether the military is buying a medication, whether the VA is, or whether CVS is, or Kaiser Permanente, or any health system in between, everybody is buying national drug codes. And so by the military project coalescing around national drug codes, and they say themselves, this is a model for the nation. And they're some of the first ones to do this, but we really hope we can get broader action on this and adoption. And the bottom line concept is simple. When you're buying anything, there's usually a few different suppliers, then some variation in price, and some levels of other elements that you consider, some quality elements. And today, that column, that score column of anything related to quality is entirely missing. And it's at least creating one And hopefully there will be others down the road, but this is a great start at some red, yellow, green quality scores. And ideally, you're purchasing low cost, high quality generic drugs to get to patients. And so this whole concept. This isn't just Valisher saying, well, this is red and that is green. This is based on a scoring framework that a consortium of healthcare key opinion leaders like Harry and other top pharmacists, doctors, biostatisticians throughout the United States came together to construct this framework of how do you do all this hard work to boil things down into a red, yellow, green quality risk scores. Red doesn't automatically mean that it's against the law or that it has to be recalled. It's just that it is higher risk. It is a higher risk product than a green, which isn't automatically the best either. It's just that these are objective metrics to stratify the quality risk of these various products. And by the way, the next big question we often get is, well, what about cost? We do need cheap drugs here too. And we have not seen any correlation to quality of almost any kind of metric and cost. And this is coming from data from the paper. And this was valsartan, actually, just a few years after the big recalls. And you don't see any correlation. You can get a low-cost green generic drug, and you can even get a higher-cost red one. Like, why would you do that? So to get into fast forward into some data that I know everybody's very interested in, and this is still just early initial data and results, and still going through secondary testing and everything else, and we'll hopefully have some publications down the road. But for now, at least what it looks like when it comes together is we have a number of different categories of chemical tests. In this case, looking at an initial sweep of tacrolimus, where we were looking obviously at things like dosage, effectiveness type tests, safety type tests, carcinogens, toxic elements, and we were seeing some areas of concern that had risk scoring implications in dosage. And what was incredibly serendipitous is that while we were doing this scoring, there was actually an alert that came out from the FDA on this manufacturer A that it was actually not bioequivalent. It's not AB rated, and this came out.
Let's go back for 1 second. Go back one slide.
Sure. Yeah. Stop me at any time, please.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the drug that scored an initial score of 39 was the heart transplant medication that was keeping me alive. And I had to change my manufacturer when the FDA put this alert out. And I have now moved to name brand, which is a different formulary placement on all of my insurance now. So I'm paying more money out of pocket. But I am getting the drug that I need, not something that didn't have the right chemical makeup. So this is very real. This impacts real people, and I'm one of them. And my heart transplant medication scored a 39 out of 100, not making me feel real secure. So that's why I jumped to name brand only. And I'm taking less drug now while I have name brand because it's a higher quality, and that actually has implications to my kidney health long term. So this work actually was like completely part of my life. This result led to my personal regimen changing. So thank you, David, for keeping Brandy safe in my chest. And I just wanted to bring home that this is not some conceptual thing. This is real people. David, please continue.
Yeah, no, and it is. Thank you for that really important reminder that when we're talking about all this, it's incredibly frustrating that we have so many issues as they are in supply chains and these kind of esoteric concepts. But this hits home for millions and millions of hundreds of millions of Americans. The majority of Americans take a prescription drug every day, and they're all susceptible to these kinds of issues. And the answer shouldn't be having to pay more out of pocket from a patient. There are high quality generic drugs that are out there. We're missing that transparency, and we're missing a lot of the healthcare stakeholders taking action on it. And we'll hopefully see more of that. And like I was saying, as you pointed out, this really has patient impact. And the FDA ran clinical trials or funded them that was based on concerns that were flagged on this particular product from this manufacturer. And that took 11 years. It took 11 years to conduct all this work to finally result in this product being actually not even taken off the market. It was just no longer AB rated, which is a whole layer of complexity that we don't even get into here. But the point is that it was different. It was so different that it was no longer the same as the other generics in the regulatory framework. And the point, back to the cost, and we ran this analysis on the tacrolimus as well, is that again we see no correlation to quality. You can get a high quality generic drug for a low price, and there often are a lot of greens. Some of these drugs that have had issues for a while, we see a higher concentration of reds. But there's still plenty of greens. Most of the products we see, we often get asked, how often does something not pass your certifications and these kinds of programs that we have, and it's very broadly speaking about 10%. That means 90% is pretty high quality. 60, 70% or so green, like outstripping all the rest. It's there's a lot of good out there, and we need to incentivize it.
And we need to let patients know. So right now we're just labeling these manufacturer A through Q in this particular screen, but we need a place where patients and our local pharmacists can go to find out what this quality is. And that means setting up some type of national standard, which I hope we will get to. But this is very troubling that we can't have access yet to this information. So I hand it back to you. I just had to jump in there.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it is a difficult problem, right? And it's a problem that patients have unfortunately very little power over. You can pick which mid-size sedan you want to buy, but many times it's very hard to pick which generic drug manufacturer you want from your pharmacy. Harry's grappled with this extensively as a prescriber, as the doctor even. So anyway, looking at the data again, in this case on metoprolol, I know certainly a very important drug in the world of cardiology, and important again to military, for forward deployment, for the military health system. So I think it's a good example of a lot of overlap between something like a Defense Department essential medicine.
There's one other thing to add here. If we have a drug that we're treating somebody's chest pain or their shortness of breath or measuring their blood pressure, that's one thing. But how about if you have a drug that you're given to somebody you're treating a cancer, and
Sure.
you don't know whether because they're not getting better because the cancer is very bad or the drug's no good, and that's a very, very serious problem. And there have been chemotherapeutic drugs out there that people haven't done well with. And the question is it because the drug's bad or the disease is bad? And that's a horrible, horrible problem. Similar to when you talk about a heart transplant. Well, somebody donated that heart, and you're going to waste it because the tacrolimus is no good. And so you've got two people, and you have one person that died donating a heart, and the other one that accepted it. And here you got a drug that doesn't work. That's a big problem.
Yeah, no, and I think you underscore a really important point that this is broad. This is a broad issue, and we have to act on it. I mean, 91% of all the drugs that people take in the United States are generic drugs. And again, not to say that all generic drugs are bad. Actually, most of them are quite good, but some are not. Some are red. And we saw this in this particular initial sweep on the metoprolol, where we're here and there finding some toxic element concerns. This does happen on occasion, where there's lead, arsenic, cadmium, these kinds of very bad contaminants that can crop up from a variety of places in the supply chain. But in this case, the big implication on a lot of the scoring came from what's called dissolution. And what that means is how a tablet's coming apart over time. And this is another important element of the effectiveness of a drug. It's not just how many milligrams of a drug is there in that tablet. It's also how it dissolves over time. And what we're looking at here, to just go a little bit deeper into that data, is looking at all these various manufacturers with one test. And by the way, separate issue is that every generic manufacturer is allowed to design their own test for their own product, even if it's the exact same. It's all metoprolol. So it's like shooting an arrow and then painting a target around it. And really what we're doing with this testing is not just looking at the USP monograph that they're allowed to register themselves, but pick one test, simulated gastric fluid, followed by simulated intestinal fluid, and use these kind of scientific standards to paint one target and then see where all the arrows fall. And so that's what you're looking at here. And in the dark black line is the dissolution, how the drug is coming apart for the brand that went through all the clinical trials with thousands of people and designed not only the drug, the milligrams of the active ingredient, they also designed the structure around that drug, how it comes apart in your body. A really important point. And
so David, I'm going to pause you for a second so our listeners can understand a little bit about the Generic Drug Act and what was available when it went into law and what controlled release mechanisms mean in that process, and how that controlled release mechanism is really why maybe some people drop the drug really quickly or others don't metabolize it. Can you explain a little bit about that chemistry?
Yeah, and there's a really good, again, to bring it home to an example, another really important person in Catherine Eban's book that Harry was in is Joe Graydon, a best-selling author, pharmacologist, and he identified exactly this kind of issue in an antidepressant drug called Wellbutrin, and its generic bupropion. And what he saw, like Harry has seen with his own patients, was tremendous numbers of complaints when it went generic. And after years of back and forth and finally some testing that was done, was that the active ingredient was pretty much there in these tablets, but the generic tablet was releasing way too much drug way too quickly in the body. That was different than the brand. And it's effectively what we're kind of looking at here. Is it's not just what is the total amount of active ingredient, is how is it coming apart in your body? How fast is it releasing that? And a lot of people might be familiar with extended release products. You might have an acetaminophen or a Tylenol 8-hour. Well, what's the difference between the Tylenol 8-hour and just standard Tylenol that you would buy, extra strength? The difference is what they put into the ingredients and the formulation of that tablet, so that it's slowly releasing the active ingredient, the drug, over time. And in some drugs, like metoprolol succinate, that's actually really important. It's a really important point of how the drug works. It's really important in certain antidepressant drugs, like Wellbutrin or bupropion XL. That's what is the implications here in this testing, in this Defense Department study and scoring framework concept, is that there's going to be red, yellow, greens for how close are you to the brand. In this case, there's a lot of tests that doesn't matter if you're brand or not, whether you have lead in your product. If the brand does, it'll also get a bad score. If the generic does, it would get a red score, and vice versa. But in terms of the dissolution, a therapeutic important property, the framework says that it's comparing it to the brand. And it's a bit technical, but these curves in black is really what the brand has established, and then in gray you see all these various generics and how they're dissolving over time. And you don't need to be a biostatistician to see that there's differences by eye, right? You can see that this one with the squares on the bottom is not behaving the same as the rest. And what all of this data comes together to create is what's called a difference percentage. And that's what you see on the right. and then the expert review panel, co-authors of that paper, including folks like Dr. Harry Lever, come together and say, well, this is where we're going to draw the lines for red, yellow, green, and you get a score. And how much better would we all be if we can incentivize consistency to be as close to this black line as you possibly can at a low cost, and push away from those, and also makes it very clear how to fix it. This is how you fix it. You get closer to the black line. So if you're red now, this is how to get green. I think that's an important part of the transparency as well. And we're starting to see a lot of studies in this space. A lot of people ask, there's actually, when you look at the academic literature, in certain therapeutic classes, like epilepsy, when it's very clear when your medication doesn't work, unfortunately, you could have a breakthrough seizure. You could have more head fractures. You could have more hospitalizations. And there's studies that show that's what happens when you have generic to generic switching. You have a lot more of that happening. So obviously there's differences in the composition and how these generics are working. And this can cost a lot of money to the health system. This could be creating a lot of public health harm, thousands of potentially heart attacks, strokes, hospitalizations, relapses. All of these things could be happening, according to these studies, with lower quality generic drugs. And these calculations that we've been looking at are really trying to look at the bottom 10%. Like if that's roughly the amount of these reds that we could hopefully screen out and either fix, incentivize away from, or just not have be part of our supply chain, we could be saving billions of dollars and saving lives, preventing thousands of really terrible adverse events, potentially. And that's obviously very important. And I think the good news is that large healthcare stakeholders and systems are really starting to get more and more engaged on this. The fact that the Defense Department is really pushing to create this national model of red, yellow, green scores that are attached to the national drug codes that not only they can use, but all sorts of health system buyers and payers can utilize as well. And we should push for them to do that. And also, the Kaiser Permanente model, by the way, for a few years now, and really have been scaling this up, where they have a lot of data that they look at. This kind of chemistry data, just one potential input of who are red, yellow, green manufacturers, and then they contract with green. So when they're buying 10 million tablets over the course of a year of drug X, they're not only saying we want to look at a lot of data of who to buy from in the first place, they add to their contracts the requirement to have an ongoing certification, so that every batch, every time a million tablets arrives at a Kaiser warehouse, it will have already gone through independent testing, independent certification, to essentially make sure they're staying green. And that's an important risk component. From the data side, we'll only have snapshots of data, which is way better than nothing. But to have large health systems like Kaiser really leading the way in how this could be really addressed on an ongoing basis, have data to pick green in the first place, and then require ongoing testing to make sure they stay green. I think another model for the nation, and something that gives me, at the very least, a lot of hope that we're going in the right direction in a large scale, so that patients and doctors that are really engaged with this, like Harry, hopefully can worry less about this issue, and is great model for the future.
Another
happy to answer questions.
Other thing to worry about is how's the drug shipped. With the weather
controlled by temperature regulation.
If you're shipping drugs in hot trucks, they may come out of the factory all right, but by the time they get to the patient, they may not work because they're overheated. So
and by the way, that's an important point. It's very nuanced, but actually part of even the Defense Department project is that we're not screening in this kind of broad market sweep from the manufacturers. We're not asking the manufacturer for a sample. We're taking it from the supply chain, as far down the supply chain as we can, which is from the distributors. So it's most similar to what a patient would actually get at the very end of the supply chain, and has been shipped, around the world, has been sitting in warehouses, has at least had some of that, supply
Exposure.
chain time and exposure, and it's we call it independent sourcing, and that's, to your point, an important part of getting some of that kind
The
of
other
data.
thing that patients have to be aware of is they should not remove the drug from the pharmacy until they look at it and make sure that the manufacturer hasn't been changed, because there's a lot of that going on also. You've got to, if what you're taking is working, that's another unknown. You've got to make sure that the pharmacy did not change the manufacturer.
So to the HCM community that's viewing and will view later, there's an easy fix in a sense for the Toprol issue, metoprolol. If you have your physician write a script for dispense as written Toprol XL, and you go to your local pharmacy and you produce a GoodRx card, the national prices now are somewhere between $29 and $32 for a 30-day supply of name brand drug. You're not using your insurance, you're going around it, which is really kind of awful. We should be able to get name brand drug at a reasonable rate. But that's the way to make sure you're getting the right metoprolol. I will tell you that in the past 10 years, when somebody calls out of the blue, I've been stable for so long, something's changed. The last 2 weeks, I'm not right. Did you get a new bottle of drugs? Did you look at the bottle? Well, yeah, they were a little different. You might want to go back to your other manufacturer, go back to your pharmacist and tell them that this is not a good mix for you. Sometimes they get new drugs, sometimes they don't, but you can get the GoodRx dispenses written and then just go buy it for cash, and it's not going to go through your insurance, so it should get filled. I hate that it's a bigger out-of-pocket expense for our patients and our clients, but it's the way that you need to do it if you really want the name brand. Last year, I attended a conference in Washington, D.C. called CVCT, Cardiovascular Clinical Trialists. Really interesting meeting. One of my favorite of the year. It's in a couple weeks again. But I sat there listening to really smart cardiologists, really smart researchers, wondering why the real world data and outcomes from certain studies aren't proving to be borne out in real life. And I said, well, are your patients getting name brand or generic? They said, what does that matter? Like pretty much everything. So it was an aha moment in that room to say, wait a minute. Do we know what our patients are taking? Are they getting 80% of what we think they should get? Or are they getting 125% of what we think they should get? What's going on? So I think we need to really look at the outcomes data, the quality of life issues with these patients. And if in doubt, check that manufacturer. That could be the reason why the patient's not feeling as well. In the transplant world, I know people who have required second heart transplants because they went into rejection after they've been stable for many years because their tacrolimus was not doing the job. I know you showed 550 some odd organ transplant recipients impacted. A few of them I know died. So you go through all that battle and you go through all that work. I gotta tell you, surviving a transplant is not for the wimps out there. It's hardcore patienting. To have lost that battle because of the quality of the drug that was provided to you by your insurance provider, because they choose which one you get, that's really frightening, and we can't have that happen. David, do you see a light at the end of this tunnel? Unintended.
I do, and I definitely share your sentiment that this is so frustrating from a patient perspective that you're having to think about paying more for something that even exists. Like, as the data shows, there's a lot of good generics out there.
Absolutely.
And it is frustrating. I'm sure this is way more frustrating for somebody like Harry than it's for me, a newcomer, certainly compared to Harry, having to deal with these issues. But I do see a light at the tunnel, and it's not only do I see it, it's getting brighter. I don't know how quickly it's going to like really encompass and we actually get to that full light, but it is making progress. You know, the fact that it's not just the little Valisher pharmacy that we started off with, where we had a few thousand patients, and Harry came to visit us, and others from the Cleveland Clinic, which is great, right? And if you happen to be a patient of the Cleveland Clinic, you could benefit from all the work that they do on their pharmaceutical supply chain and on some of the blacklists of certain manufacturers that Harry helped push for and are talking about also in Catherine Eben's book. But what if you're not, right? What if you're not part of the Kaiser Permanente system? What if you're not in the military health system? Then it's incredibly frustrating. And so I would tell you that my hope and the light at the end of the tunnel that I'm seeing is because there's so many problems that are piling up because of this lack of quality transparency, lack of quality being part of our pharmaceutical supply chain, part of generic drugs from an independent standpoint, that more has to be done, right? There's Senate hearings about this. There's congressional hearings on the Senate and the House. It's one of the only, many have told us this that are Democrats and Republicans, this is one of the only bipartisan topics in DC, period, healthcare and otherwise. And that's what gives me a lot of hope and I think a real light at the end of the tunnel. When we announced this project with the Defense Department, we had leading Democrat, Congressman Rosa DeLauro, that's been super supportive about this for many years, and Congressman Neil Dunn from Florida, Republican and Democrat, both saying the same things about how much they care about this mission that the military is on, how much they want high quality drugs, not just for our service members, of course, and our veterans, but for the nation. There's a model for the nation. We need to do more. So that is, I think, really functional light, like real light that's out there. These kinds of programs that are big, that are already improving the system for millions of Americans, and we need to go from a few dozen million to hundreds of millions. But the fact that there is real light and it's growing brighter gives me a lot of confidence that we really will be able to tackle this at a high level, and people's voices are at least being heard and actions taken.
So we know that all political affiliations, they all have heart problems, they all have cancers, they all have medical problems. Everybody's got a
Absolutely.
need for high quality pharmaceuticals. I think, and I'll be an ounce, I don't know what I'll be, but you'll figure it out. We need collaboration. We need good science.
Absolutely.
We need reasonable pathways. And I do not believe that any American wants to take a pill when they don't really know what's in it. And we should all be stopping and thinking every time we pick up a bottle, who made this, what's in it, and how can I be sure? And that means we need transparency. We need to know what all of these manufacturers are doing, and when they fail a test, everybody can fail a test, people. It's not the end of the world. You had a bad batch, go back and do it again. Bring it to us again. To the manufacturers in expat areas, whether you're in India, Turkey, China, and you're manufacturing, we're not saying we don't want your product. We want to prove that it's good product and
That's
that
right.
we're getting what we're paying for and nothing additional and nothing that could harm us. I don't think this is a really high bar. I think it's pretty low. We're not looking to change everything. We're not looking for name brand only. But then there's the other part of this. And it's not your side of the house. It's the economic side of the house. And that is when I saw your slide presentation and saw the actual retail price of tacrolimus, My current health plan has it on Tier 4 formulary for a copay of $120 flat, and the drug costs $108. So we need some regulatory language on healthcare plans that they cannot charge the equal amount to the drug or more. Why am I paying $120 for something they paid $108 for? That's just not right. But that is a fight for another day. We think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We think that transparency and testing will lead to better quality. What would a system look like, David, if we could check our manufacturers? What's the dream world?
Yeah, well, I think the dream world is that we're solving this from a broad economic supply chain perspective, which is frustrating because that takes time. But that's the dream, is that the whether it's the insurance companies or the distributors, the group purchasing organizations, all these pharmacy benefit managers, all this alphabet soup that I had never heard of until getting into this world myself, is just taking quality into account, right? And I think it is truly that simple. In terms of a high level idea, in practice, everything is always more difficult than it sounds. But that is the holy grail there, and I don't think it is unreasonable in the fact that we have large health systems like the military, like Kaiser Permanente, and others, and we've seen it work in a small scale, with their own, mail order pharmacy for a few years. We've been seeing it in a larger scale. It means these are very important proofs of principle that this does work and can scale. And I think you're absolutely right. You're touching on something that we need more transparency, period. And that's not just to chemistry quality, and that's a complex topic, but can we boil it down to red, yellow, greens? Obviously, we're showing we can do that too. But also, where are things that where your shirt's coming from, you don't know where your meds are coming from, right? And this permeates throughout, unfortunately, the pharmaceutical supply chain, where there's tremendous lack of transparency. And even if you do have some label on your bottle of location or manufacturer, depending on all sorts of circumstances, that could just be who put the sticker on it. That actually came up in the Senate hearing just a few months ago on this project on pharmaceutical quality in the Defense Department and the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Colonel Retired Suarez was talking specifically about this problem, where there's actually a loophole where if you're selling to the federal supply schedule, at least, you can just put your sticker on the bottle and say that it's from the United States, because the sticker was made in the United States. And I think if you're a scientist, or if you're just an average person, thinking about that idea, that seems like nonsense.
I had that happen recently, where there's a new Indian manufacturer who has an office in New Jersey. I think it's a PO box from what I've been able to look at. Right. And they were claiming that it was made in the USA.
Right.
And I said, we don't make any generic Metoprolol in the US that I'm currently aware of. And we certainly aren't doing it in Jersey. And where that address is, there's no manufacturing plant. So you have to break it down that that's not really where they're coming from. And the fact that somebody could stick that on a label legally is really not fair to the consumer, to the physician, and to the companies that are producing things in the United States. So I don't know how to fix that one.
Yeah, no, and by the way, and that it was pointed out in that hearing, it's called the Acetris loophole. And there is some push to try and address that, but I think it's a good example of it's really hard to get transparency in this supply chain, certainly of pharmaceuticals. And I think you point out another thing, that this is another thing that hurts American manufacturing. If somebody's actually interested to buy American or to incentivize American manufacturing, they don't even know what is truly American or not. Yes, the sticker might have made in the United States, but that's probably not what you're thinking about when you're trying to buy an American product. And something else that's come up in a variety of hearings over the last year is that the American generic drug manufacturing base that still does exist in the United States is at roughly 50% capacity, which is terrible from an economic standpoint. That means they're barely holding on. And we don't need billions of dollars of infrastructure investment, which always would be nice to build more facilities. But the current facilities that are there, could just have more business if we incentivized quality, if we incentivize location quality, if we incentivize chemical quality. All these kinds of things could really help American manufacturing. Even the Defense Department and the VA and these folks that are on the federal supply schedule, well, there's laws that they're supposed to incentivize American manufacturing, ideally. If you're just making the sticker here, shouldn't we be addressing those kinds of loopholes? So I think the light at the end of the tunnel, the fact that these are actually coming up in these hearings, and there's serious people that want to push for solutions, and I hope to see more of them soon.
As do I, and hopefully we'll head to the Hill soon. We are still trying to plan our annual Hill Day, which I think is going to look a little different than maybe I thought it was going to look last year. We really need to double down on access to healthcare through the pathways that have been afforded to us through the ACA, and where at least I think it's 15 million Americans are getting their healthcare through that portal. And a very large percentage of our constituents get their healthcare through the ACA. And we need to maintain that people with pre-existing medical conditions can get healthcare without paying exorbitant fees. And we have to make sure that the drugs that we are giving them are actually doing the job that we need them to do. And I don't think that's too much to ask. I think transparency is reasonable. If you don't favor transparency in this particular space, I could not even figure out the argument for no transparency. There's no professional IP here that we're protecting. This is generic drugs. The manufacturing process is quite straightforward. If they're putting fillers into their drugs, we need to know that that shouldn't be done. We shouldn't have any caustic material in our drug supply. And we need to be awake and alert as the DOD and now the VA appear to be. And if DOD can do it and VA can do it, the rest of us deserve our drugs evaluated as well. Okay, gentlemen, this has been an enlightening talk. If anybody has any questions, they've been very quiet through this particular session, but I'll give them a minute to drop a question now if anybody who's watching has one. If you're watching this after its original airing and you have a question, you are welcome to email the HCMA at support@4hcm.org, and we will be happy to float any questions with our panelists here if you catch us after the real-time publication. Harry, any final closing thoughts on the topic? What are your hopes for the future?
Well, I hope that we can get this problem fixed, and I think we have to demand that every batch of drugs be tested. There should be no question about it. And the thought that what you're buying is not working because it's not made well, that's really stupid. And it's got to stop. I mean, you just cannot, we had one patient that was getting metoprolol by a company, whose name I won't mention, that we got it tested and it dissolved within 1 minute. 1 minute. And the guy, when we realized he was in trouble, I mean, he really was in trouble. He went into heart failure. And once we realized what happened, and once we were able to get him off that stuff, he got significantly better, all because the stuff didn't dissolve properly. I mean, you just don't allow that to happen. And this whole business about putting some company, Indian or Chinese company, that then you say USA after it, that's just false. You got to know where it's made. If I want to go visit that place, I want to know where I'm going to take the plane to. Not, you can't. This is not right. And this has become this is a new problem that, I mean, they just think they can put down the, where their one office is, and that makes it the United States. No way.
So we have a question from a viewer that must use mail-in for maintenance drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And they were sent a manufacturer that has been problematic multiple times, Dr. Reddy.
Mm-hmm.
And I refused based on Dr. Lover's warning years ago. So that's first a statement and then a question. When will this information be available to the patients? This information is available to the patients. It is also available to the doctors. It's also available to the PBMs who buy the drugs. They're choosing not to do anything about it yet. And it is our hope that there will be methods passed that will require transparency in the manufacturer's location and the quality of the drug in the bottle. And there should be, in a perfect world, a place that you could go that is a trusted site, maybe run by the government, maybe run by somebody else, where you can check transparency ratings. And I believe that all of these reports should be open to the public, but they're not right now. It's a proprietary situation, and it's a hush hush, and maybe they get an FDA letter saying your quality was substandard, and they have time to take action, or they have time to ignore it. David, how long did it take my transplant medication from Accord to get evaluated? 11 years.
11 years, yeah. And it is a frustrating point, and I think the other element to that is like, look, we publish a great deal of our studies in the peer-reviewed academic literature and in scientific journals, in FDA citizen petitions. We've done 8 of those, and oftentimes it's very complex. We have a lot of patients and consumers that reach out to us and says, well, which one should I just buy? And it's often just not that simple. Right? There's various levels of these various contaminants, and sometimes you see it batch to batch. Sometimes it's more consistent in manufacture, less consistent. We published not long ago a study with Stanford University. Professor Kevin Schulman has been a pioneer in this space from both the economic and the scientific side. And we published it on metformin. You can look it up. All the data is there. We published all of it. But it's very hard to even boil it down. I think that's one of the brilliant things about the Defense Department project is that it's going to be radio green, right? If you're going to look at all the data that we have on nitrosodimethylamine and dimethylformamide and all these big words and levels and nanograms and micrograms and all these kinds of things, we can spend another whole hour explaining that, or we can boil it down into a red, yellow, green. And making it transparent, and really getting the health systems to take action on it, so that you're going to get green when you pick it up. You're going to get the label with information on it. If your T-shirt tells you where it was made, surely your medication can tell you the same and be accurate. And with quality, would there be a red or a green or a yellow there? At some point, could there be other ways to get patients and doctors more engaged on it? I hope so in the future, and hopefully it gets fixed so that it's a true green. By the way, the FDA has had a 5-star rating system that they've talked about for over a decade. Yeah. To rank quality management maturity of facilities. I think one of the problems in getting that off the ground is the fact that you don't buy from a facility, you buy National Drug Code, and it goes through all these stickers and labels and complexities, which is another reason that the military project, I think, is so powerful. But the concept is not new, right? You have 5-star ratings for every little tchotchke you buy on Amazon. Why wouldn't you have it for your drugs and your facilities and everything else that goes along that line?
So we're going to wrap this thing up and have our answers by what, end of next week?
I'm getting there. We're getting there.
So we have to do a lot of really new kind of work. Okay. Healthcare is not going to be delivered like it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's going to change. How we get access to our information about the therapies we choose to embark on, whether they be drug therapy or other types of interactions, surgery, catheter-based ablations, things on that nature for us. We really need to know about the quality and the safety of all of these materials. We need to understand what we are doing to our body to help it and what we might be doing to hurt it. And we must be given the power to make wise decisions. And when we are taking medications that have toxins in them or are not the dosing that is appropriate for our condition, we're actually just adding to the healthcare burden. We're not solving any problems. And we need to come together to solve problems. I don't exactly know how long it's going to take to get there, but knowing that the drug that I was given from the day I came home from the hospital with my transplanted heart had already been investigated for 3 years by the FDA, and it was still the one that they chose to give me. And then I was getting, my dosage just kept going up and up and up and up and up. There was just too much drug. And then I was starting to shake again, and I was having these side effects. And I'm like, what should my dose be? And we fixed my dose. Now that I'm on name brand, I'm taking only 1 milligram in the morning and 1.5 at night. And that's it. That's all I'm taking. I was taking a lot more than that. What damage did I do to my kidneys? That I worry about that. My father died of kidney failure. I'm not HCM, so I'm very protective of my kidneys. And now I have a chance to course correct a little bit, but how much damage was done? I'll never know. And I'll never know how much was directly related to the fact that my drugs were not the quality I thought they were. So people shouldn't have to worry about this. It's hard enough to get through these battles. It's hard enough to manage HCM. It's hard enough to manage life with transplant. And then I got to worry, wait, what does the really tiny print say way up there on the bottle about where this drug actually came from? And then I got to get my glasses on, and then I got to look it up, and then I got to check it on the internet and see if they're good guys or bad guys. It shouldn't be this difficult. You should be able to trust what's in the bottle, trust that it was inspected, trust that it's what it's supposed to be and nothing else. We would not allow our food from the grocery store to have, it's chopped meat plus, we just threw some of this chemical and that chemical in there for you too, because we just thought it would enhance our profit. We can't do that. So why are we saying it's okay to do that with a pill?
And I think you touched on something extremely important. Like the core of all of this is enhancing trust. That's why we created Voucher. We wanted more trust in all our own medications that we were taking. Adam was telling me that from the very beginning. He's like, if we can just make sure I'm getting more trust in what I'm taking, we did something, and let's now get that to others. It's not to say don't ever take a generic drug or the drug system is horrible or so on and so forth. It's having the humility to recognize that there's real problems that we need to address, and increasing the trust when you're taking that medication.
I hope that this podcast gets its way to the regulators and to those who are interested in helping solve the problem. Through the next year, our legislative advocacy committee will be working on items and events that we want to move forward with. Bringing light to this issue is going to be one of our battle cries this year, along with making sure we maintain access to healthcare regardless of our pre-existing medical conditions. These two issues are just core, and they have to be. We have to fight these fights. It's kind of boring. I fought some of these already, but some of them are new. Let's go do it again. Let's make sure we don't lose ground in making sure that everybody gets access to healthcare and the right drugs at the right time. David, Harry, thank you so much for joining us today on Tales from the Heart. A big shout out to all of our sponsors who support these programs and these conversations, which sometimes are kind of deep and the answers aren't easy. But together, I think we can make it a little bit better than it is today, and hopefully lead to a world of full transparency and economic information being available so people can make wise choices. Harry, David, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your collaboration on this. We need more of it.
We're right there with you. We're going to do this together. Thanks, guys. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, so just hang on a sec. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.